I'd like today to talk a little bit about some of the forerunners of the game of chess and other board games and other kinds of games that were known in the Middle Ages, using in large part objects from the Metz collection. And we will look at a few games before the age of computers and television and all these popular games for which I'm totally unfamiliar, I must be honest. But the ones that we do have in the Metz collection are really quite extraordinary. I will focus on one figure from the Metz collection that's directly related to the Lewis Chessmen, but also looking at other examples. But let's first look at some of the forerunners of the game of chess. It was known, certainly from the ancient world, games of chess, games of board games, not necessarily chess. Obviously, we've just heard about that. And the earliest Western examples are known primarily from archaeological sources in Western Europe. And we know that some forms of games existed both in the Roman Empire but also in the Celtic world, and it was widespread, popular, and culturally a significant phenomenon, even among the Celts, who you don't often think of being interested in playing games, more in conquest. But it is known from the first millennium AD that there were very interesting games that survived both in Ireland and in Great Britain during this period. We have, for example, from the 7th century, from an archaeological strata of an excavation in central Rome itself called Crypta Balba, a set of game pieces in glass and dice, and we'll have a detail of them there. That's the box from which they came. It's been reconstructed, but there is the game board for which the game was played. We don't know the moves of these games, though. That's the unfortunate thing. There was no printed or published set of rules for them. It does have 26. There's another set that's known from Colchester, England, that obviously under Roman dominion from the 1st century AD, that comes from Colchester, and there's 26 glass pieces from that setting. The game in Rome was called 12 Scripta, and we have pieces that are dated, because they're bone, from radiocarbon dating to around the 1st century BC to 1st century AD. Linguistically, from Irish sources, we know that there was the game called Fidgel, and Fidg meaning wood and Chidel meaning intelligence seemed to imply that there was some level of intelligence of special status for such games. Thus, board games of this nature indicate that there was a certain active interest on various strata of society. But let's look at another games, and we know that they are known from other linguistic sources, from Irish, Fidgel, to Welsh, Gutterball, which is must have been very much like the Irish game Fidgel, and others called Mersul, a board game which had O's and X's that was pretty much like our tic-tac-toe, it sounds like, and some evidence of that survives too. And we know that certainly from medieval literature, almost all the heroes of literature played games of chess or other games, which was very much part of their education, whether it be Tristan in the great German poem, Alexander in the Alexander romances, and Lancelot in the Lancelot prose. Celtic literary sources referred to the games as men, or fur, as it is in Irish, a metaphor which finds visual expression in two examples from 5th to 7th century Scotland. Two face-decorated cones in stone were found in Scalloway and Mayo in Shetland and Shetland Islands, in a location of a broch, which is something like a fort or a castle, that are dating from the 7th century or 8th century. These are, some were undecorated cones, some were stone of various counters of sorts, again, for a game that we don't know too much about, but also flat-bottom pebbles and dice were found in these contexts. Of the rooks of the Lewis chessmen, how they are fierce figures, and one wonders if the morphology of these forms of figures in cone-like shapes didn't echo back to ancient, earlier forms from the Celtic world, for which they must have been some kind of board game, but we don't, again, know too much about that because there's no written documentation. And we know that from Irish literature also that there were injury involved in such games as this vigil, which are implied using these conical type objects that we see here, because in several cases they've been described as becoming embedded in the victim's skull. So we know that the games must have become rather active in some form or another. And as James has explained, we know already from the 13th century that these games could become quite actively competitive, if not downright deadly. In 1276, on the Eyre roll, there's a case in which David of Bristol and his Juliana is engaged in a game, and he ended up injuring her, and she died. And it said he fled. Same sources describe William of Wendon in 1254 of Essex was playing a chess game with a knight of Essex, and they quarreled also, and the knight squire knifed him in the stomach. William fled at once. So we know that these games could be quite active. The game of board games that we have surviving, the mention of the great Viking exhibition we collaborated on some years ago with the British Museum included this Irish game board on the left, and also a set of glass counters from a game board and the one on the left has, I think, 49 positions. It must have been sort of a peg form game that was maybe something like a forerunner of our game of checkers or something of that nature. But using dice was obviously the one element that determined the next move quite often in these various games that showed some skill, but also luck. But before turning to other games of the Middle Ages, let's examine in some detail one of the extraordinary Romanesque figures in the Metz collection that has a close relative in the chess figures. And the chess figures that survive from the Middle Ages are numerous. This set in Copenhagen, not a complete set, obviously it's from various different sets dating from the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And even the form of the famous set that's in the Cabinet Medaille in Paris, showing quite a different form, very large ivory-carved figures, very three-dimensional, known as the set thought to be that of Charlemagne himself, but it actually dates from the 12th century, coming from Sicily, and it merges a lot of these traditions that we have from both the Islamic Mediterranean world and the North during this period. But let's look at this figure that is on exhibition at the cloisters at the moment, normally shown down here because it came in 1911 from the celebrated collection of J. Pierpont Morgan, who acquired this medieval walrus ivory bishop in Paris, and he paid about £3,000 for it, which was an extraordinary amount at the time. The bishop sits on a high-backed throne and is vested with a cope and an alb and a gabled mitre. He grasps a crozier in his left hand while offering a benediction with his right. To his right is a genuflecting tonsured figure with a short tunic who points to an open book that is inscribed with lines. To the bishop's left is another youth with longer hair, not tonsured, who holds a short staff in his right hand and lifts his left to his head. The high-backed throne is decorated. Here's a back view of that throne, and we've seen similar things to that just now. That is not unlike that of the Lewis Chessman, and it's interlaced with this vine scroll, very rich, fleshy vine scroll on both sides, and is pierced through the back and as an open work object. It stands just 4 inches tall, terribly monumentalized here in this image, but one can immediately see that its relationship to the Lewis Chessman is physically within their range of the 16 Lewis bishop figures that survive. His general stylistic affiliations is immediately evident, but the New York bishop is not one of them for the simple technical reason that the open work handling of the vine scroll acanthus on the throne and the open work construction of the throne is not found on any of the Lewis Chessmen. That's the back of the Lewis Chessman and the back of the New York one on the right with the Lewis Chessman. So here we have these fleshy, open forms of the construction of the acanthus that are similar but not exactly like those on the Lewis Chessman. And if we go back to look at the forms here, we can see that there's similarities but also differences, especially with the drilled pupils of the eyes of the bishop on the Lewis Chessman. Not all of them, of course, but unlike that of the Met one, which does not. Aside from the 16 bishops of the Lewis Chessman board, there are very few comparable works in walrus or whale-tooth or elephant ivory to compare the New York figure. Several chess bishops have accompany such figures, and we as attendants or counselors. Thus, a bishop that was in Leipzig, it's now lost, we think, is of interest, but it is known only from a 19th century image. Here we see 2 youthful attendants, one with an open book and the other holding a pallium, sign of his status, that has crossed the lap of the bishop. A damaged bishop group in the British Museum, which James alluded to, is missing its head, and other ones also, because that is an area where they often break off, but we know it's a bishop because of his crozier that he holds. And he also has attendants next to him with books and a harp in front of him. As part of the medieval courtly culture, the representation of such figures that included attendants is not surprising. A queen chess figure with an attendant, 2 attendants, one with a musician with pipes, is in the museum in Schwerin in northern Germany, and seems to be about the same date as the Lewis Chessman. This figure is one of the closest comparative figures to the Morgan figure, but it's slightly smaller and possibly from another related set. As chess developed as a courtly pursuit, the embellishment of the game with attendants seems to have been a logical development. So who are these attendant figures to the bishop? Are they advisors, personifications, or do they have some symbolic significance? One of the figures with the New York bishop seems clear at first. Although clearly tonsured, the figure on the left, he points to a book that has lines in it, and as if to display this to the world. So the reason for him being associated with the bishop is somewhat enigmatic. Likewise, the opposite figure sits and stares out, holding a short staff in his right hand, and with his large left hand he raises it to his head. He wears a long tunic and would thus also appear to be a secular figure. One may try to interpret him as sloth, that is, evoking slumber or illustrating spiritual torpor, but his action is not clear. Or one may see him as a dejected, slumbering, perhaps a teacher, signified by his staff, who is placed opposite the one who leads the active life of reading and learning versus his status as more of a slothful figure. So such figures are more often associated with abbots than bishops. The transformation of chess from its Indian and Chinese origins to the Islamic roots and the Western world we've seen already today, and it's a subject rich in nuance and significance. But the emergence of the bishop chess figure is a later and Western development. How is his appearance to be understood? And James already referred to the extraordinary critical letter of Peter Damian to Pope Alexander II in 1061 about the game of chess and the ungodly use of chess by the Bishop of Florence in his condemnation of it, saying how shameful and senseless and disgusting it really was in his complaint to Pope Alexander. More germane to the evolution of the position of the bishop is the Communicolquium of the Franciscan of John of Wales, written in 1260 to 1282, for it gives meaning to the allegorical nature of the game. And this is a wonderful passage which I wanted to quote to you. The whole world is like a chessboard, of which one square is white and another black, following the dual state of life and death, praise and blame. The society of this chessboard are men of this world who are all taken from a common bag, placed in different parts of the world, and as individuals have different names. One is called a king, another a queen, a third a rook, a fourth a knight, a fifth a bishop, a sixth a pawn. However, the rule of this game is such that one man takes another, and when they have finished the game, just as they came out of one place and one bag, so they're put back in one place, without distinction between the king and the poor pawn, as rich and poor are together. The author goes on to describe the moves of saying how the bishop moves and captures obliquely because all prelates are corrupt and greedy, he says. He returns to the idea of conflict because at another level of meaning, the whole game is played against the devil. To be checked is to fall into sin. To be mated is to be damned to hell, from which there is no redemption. The elephant was the precursor of the bishop, just as the horse became the precursor of the knight. And the vizier, or wise man, became the queen, as we've seen. The evolution of the game as part of the knightly culture of medieval Europe established the condition for the changing roles and the names of the pieces. It may be no coincidence that at the same time that we witness the rise of the princely bishops in Ettonian and Romanesque Germany, the figure of the queen, that the bishop also makes his appearance at exactly the same time, thus reflecting not only his ecclesiastical status. Therefore, in terms of their position and allegorical significance on the board, the bishop took on an enhanced role dictated by his rising position within the courtly culture. So the appearance of bishops, with or without the latest fashion in mitres, is of some interest because there are no references to chess bishops in any documentary sources until after the year 1200. So is it possible that the image preceded changes in the terminology? From where could such a bishop come from? And we've already seen this from what James has said, that the New York bishop is so closely related to those of Lewis in their style as almost a stylistic cousin. And this is most revealing in the scroll work on the back of the throne. And this as strongly points to the town of Trondheim in Norway, where these objects must have been one of the main centers of production, especially for ivory carving and walrus carving at this time. The type of mitre of the bishop is often utilized to establish the date of the figures, and by extension that of the Lewis chessmen. And usually these are dated from the second half of the 12th century. And this is so called because the type of mitre that the bishop wears is known as the gabled mitre, which first appears both in Germany and English seals of the second half of the 12th century. The bronze effigy of a bishop, Frederick van Witten, in Magdeburg Cathedral, and he died in 1152, shows the further development of the mitre. You see him there on the right in a detail. The Magdeburg figure seems to be a barometer of representing bishops during the second half of the 12th century, when the gabled mitre becomes more common. And thus the Morgan bishop is chronologically not much later than that, and as one of the closest cousins of the Lewis chess figures, deserves an important place in the development of chess figures in the Middle Ages. One other type of figure that is closely related in bishops is a fairly new piece that's now in Paris, and you can see it here, and he has a type of a mitre that is a little bit like what Dylan showed earlier on some of the Islamic pieces, the small knobs, and in fact the top of it has these suggestive knobs indicating it's a transitional piece from the Islamic type to the Western version of a bishop. So it's within this context that these figures, the New York bishop joins his cousins and the Lewis chessmen, as we see here. And the kind of board that was surviving, or we don't have the Lewis chess board itself, but its later form can be seen in a wonderful example from Italy from the 15th century that we have here at the Met. Beautifully carved in bone, ivory, and ebony. And there we see that board with a folding board to make it more portable and accessible for people to take the game with them on their travels, as the court culture during this period was highly itinerant. Well, one of the fantastic works that we have in our Metz collection, and looking at a few things that we have here, representations of the game of chess, is a fragment of a cassone. You can see upstairs in the European Paintings Gallery, executed by the painter Librali da Verona around the year 1475. Unfortunately, this cassone was cut up. The cassone is a marriage chest, highly popular in Italy during the 14th, 15th century as a marriage gift. And this one has narrative scenes on it. But one of the most delightful images on it is this chess match between this dewy-eyed blonde beauty in the process of being checkmated. I'll let those of you who know more about the game of chess, whether it reveals an end game, I'll let you decide, and the game will tell you more about how this love match ends up. Is love trumps all, and here the chess game is just a means to an end. We also mentioned earlier, Dylan mentioned the treatise, which is one of the most pivotal documents of the game of chess by the Dominican Jacobus Caesulius around 1300, became extraordinarily popular, and William Caxton in the later part of the 15th century, in the invention of book printing, printed one of the earliest examples of it from about 1475 that had an extraordinary popularity throughout Europe. And that's a copy of one of his treatises on the left in this to evoke that match. Let us turn, though, to another form of game playing because it was the other popular game, other than chess, that prevailed in Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. And that is the game of tables, played, and unlike chess, which had 32 figures, it had 30 on each side. It was a table game, a precursor to the game of backgammon, and we'll see examples of that in a few minutes. But we happen to have a series of table figures, or table men, that represent extraordinary episodes on these figures. And the ones that are shown here are devoted to the themes of Samson, the Old Testament hero, battling his mythological predecessor, Hercules. And the juxtaposition of these two heroes from the ancient and biblical world is quite extraordinary. We have surviving of about 50 of these game pieces, not all from one set, these different subjects, and they include Samson and foxes, Samson slaying Philistines with the jawbone of an ass, Samson tearing the gates of Gaza, Samson's love for Delilah, and the Philistines coming upon the fettered Samson, Delilah accusing Samson of mockery, the shearing of Samson's hair, Samson destroying the temple of the Philistines, the burial and mourning of Samson, and other themes of him, which we'll see in a few minutes. These are often opposed, and these discs are about 3 inches, up to 3 inches in diameter, show the themes, equivalent subjects from the ancient world of Hercules, including his birth, him struggling with serpents of Juno, Hercules shooting the centaurs, Hercules feeding Diomedes to his man-eating horse, and Hercules killing the Geryon and killing of Cassius, and Hercules and the apples of the Hesperides. These are all of the heroic feats of Hercules that are known from ancient mythological literature. The models for the imaging may come from texts that compare the lives, and there we have two of them together there, Hercules and the apples of the Hesperides. On the left, it's the serpent who's protecting the tree with the apples in it. Opposite that of Samson and the foxes. And the game here, like that of chess, is two opposing sides of similar sized discs and decoration. In the case of the one on the right, it's stained red, taking the material from the madder plant. It's recommended to stain that side of the set so it can be distinguished from the more neutral, natural color of the Morris ivory on the left. The model for the images may come from texts that compare their lives. The eclogues from a 9th century treatise of Theodulf of Orleans interpret them quite literally, allegorically, and gave the moral meanings in his eclogues. And he says Hercules was a strong man whose virtue of fortitude is finally outweighed by his vices of lechery and pride. So eventually he obviously believed that Samson would triumph. As these narrative game pieces, and there's another set on the left and right, that of the Hercules on the left, and on the right, Samson slaying the Philistines, which is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. As these narrative game pieces are all produced in the city of Cologne, one of the great centers of carving of ivory in the Middle Ages, they're made mainly of walrus, a material that was readily available in Northern Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. These games and chess were considered games of chance and luck, since they were dependent upon the roll of the dice. So originally the attitude of the church was highly critical, as we've seen, and that explanation of Alexander and Peter Damian and his complaint about the games to Pope Alexander II. One wonders whether these games can be more specifically identified with particular patrons. Here we have again that of the Hercules battle, the Geryon on the left, and that of the King Hercules throwing King Diomedes to his man-eating horse on the right. It has been proposed that these works produced in Cologne towards the middle of the 12th century could have been commissioned by someone named Solomon, and we have several names of Solomon in Cologne at this time, but it's hard to really be more specific than that if there is in case any particular patronage connection here. And even from our own collection on the right, at the cloisters, another episode of Hercules being led by a boy, the blinded Hercules being led by the boy, and him in prison on the left, grinding at the millstone. The episode of that, of course, is the tearing down of the temple of the Philistines that follows this episode. Well, we happen to have a few game boards from which quite interesting examples from the 12th century for which these such game pieces we've just seen would have played on. This particular one was discovered in excavations at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just outside of Paris, and dates from the 12th century. And it shows how the game can be played with 32 sets of figures, of discs, of tables. Another unique series of tablemen shows several scenes of the ancient legend Apollonius of Tyre, known to most of you through Shakespeare's retelling of the tale as Pericles, Prince of Tyre. The story is rarely illustrated in the late antique sources, but it does survive in a few medieval game pieces. The museum was fortunate to acquire a unique example of this theme. It shows an episode on the left from the elaborate, complex love and loss epic of when Apollonius, his wife dies. He has her buried at sea. And two men are seen here lowering her coffin into the sea from the ship, and billowing sails and the hair of some of the figures suggests the activity and the drama of this particular moment in a very beautifully articulated, deeply carved, and highly illusionistic carving from Cologne of the 12th century. This figure now appears, this disc on the left appears to have an equally majestic companion in another episode that shows Apollonius learning of the terrible famine in Tarsus, and he comes to the rescue of the citizens of the stricken city with a ship full of grain. He pours it out of a sack into the hold of the ship so that this would help the city of Tarsus survive the famine. So what have these two, and here's another view of that beautifully articulated game piece that appears to be closely related to the New York figure, tableman. So what does this have to do with the game of tables, and what would possibly be the idea behind this subject? The answer may lie in another game piece that is that of the burial of Christ that you see here on the left. It's in the Burrell Collection in Glasgow. It is the same size and style of carving and has a composition suggesting that it was part of a related set. And thus the theme of the complete set would have been divided between, in this case, the life of Christ, the burial of Christ that you see on the upper left there, with that of Apollonius of Tyre. So what is the connection between the life of Christ and Apollonius? Here we see that the scene that we have represented would be the burial of Christ, and the allusion would be to that of Apollonius, whose wife, her coffin was washed up ashore near the city of Ephesus, and 3 days later she was found alive in her coffin and saved by the local people of Ephesus. So it certainly suggests that that the subject was a connection between the biblical episodes and the passion, perhaps, of Christ, with that of the survival and the miraculous survival and resurrection of the wife of Apollonius of Tyre. Some other game pieces are quite whimsical in their forms. The one on the left, that taking the theme of these bishops, kind of mocking them in some ways, in an amusing way, of a wild man dressed as a bishop, almost wielding an axe and riding some kind of a sea monster. And in other subjects the great variety that you find on these is seen quite often on subjects that are quite extraordinary. In this case, Scorpio, one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, would have been one subject of a game of tables. Even others that are more mysterious as to what they really mean, the one on the left in the Metz collection of a hare being attacked by an eagle on the left, and that of a group of men being attacked by a bear, or it might be a subject from a classical mythology of Menelaus and his companions. Well, they did play these games in the Middle Ages, and they quite often were illustrated in many different forms in manuscripts. And the famous Loutrell Psalter of about 1330 shows a man and a woman playing on a board looking like a backgammon board. They're enclosed within this garden that is clearly set up for their game, suggesting the board game symbolizes a game of love, and also by their gestures that you see here. And we happen to have kinds of boxes in the museum's collection that seem to be suggestive that they are intended to hold games. Fantastic figures depicted on these game boxes. This is a wood box, beautifully articulated, and here's the opening part of it to show the division where the game discs would have been placed within the box. One of the extraordinary things about this box is the fact that, go back to the first one, I think. Yes, you can see it very clearly here. If you look carefully, the lid of it is an extraordinary example of dogs, a series of dogs going, profile dogs looking to the left, but in fact, if you turn it upside down and look at it, they're going to the right in green. So it's kind of a trompe-l'oeil, or to fool the eye, a very a visual trick that we have extraordinarily few examples from the Middle Ages that show this this playful use of imagery in this way. And even such little animals as the puppy dog on the right. He looks like he's up for the Oscar nomination. Didn't quite get it, but he's quite a marvelously articulated dog. And other game boxes are multi-purpose. You can see here's one. The top of the box is with which you keep your game pieces within, and the top of the box would be that for the game of tables. And you flip the box over on the bottom of it. You can play another board game, presumably that of chess or some other table game. Well, it wasn't all just games. On board games. There are other kinds of games that survive, and the representations of these games are quite playful in the context of what we have in the museum's collection. When you begin to link these according to pastimes and moments of pleasure and fun. Here we have the game of Quinton shown in two different forms, one on a silver-stained rondo from the end of the 15th century, and the other on a box, a so-called mini-question as it's known, on the left. And it's a game that was really developed out of a knightly pursuit of jousting, training knights. But here the figure of called Quinton, as it's called, is a balancing game where you kind of kick your partner the foot and try to get them off their balance. So this type was usually played by, could be played by knights, but also by peasants at the same time. And even in such celebrated manuscripts as the Hours of Jean d'Evreux, housed at the cloisters, this wonderful image of the Annunciation, which dominates the page, and the patron, Jean d'Evreux, at prayer in the initial reading her Book of Hours, surmounts a image at the bottom of the page of a very playful subject, and it seems to be that of the game called Blind Man's Bluff on the page of the Annunciation. Now, whether this game is you put your head in the lap of a young lady and cover your eyes, and people strike you, and you try to guess who it is. Once you've guessed who it is, that person is it. So how this figures into the subject of the Annunciation is a bit of a mystery. It may simply be the contrast of the devout life and of Jean versus that of the court, or maybe just the artist having fun here, showing this particular subject. But we certainly know these games from different representations in ivory and in other media, and for example, that of the subject of hot cockles, where the figure is seated and tries to reach out and touch somebody, and again, that person is it. These are playful courtly games that were popular in the period of Northern Europe, especially during the 13th and 14th centuries. A recently acquired game box, or a casket, romance casket, at the Princeton University of Art has on it a very similar scene as we've just witnessed on the ivory that we see here. Again, this very playful gestures of figures having great fun. And even the Metz collection has depicted on it one of the tapestries that we have in the collection, and a monumental version of this game of Blind Man's Bluff, where the figures are tormenting the youth who's blindfolded in the center, and with the inscription above, Le Temps Salon. So according to the times, this playful moment of the figures enjoying their moment at play in the garden. And even on such humble objects as sundials, such games could be represented, as we have here on this Nuremberg sundial from the later part of the 15th century. The games of chess, though, were the ones that are most frequently represented on various objects of deluxe consumption, and the pastimes that we see depicted, especially on mirror backs. These are the backside of a mirror that would be representing various subjects devoted to the pastimes of the court, and the game of chess, of course, is the one that we see the most often. On these images, though, the charm of the young lady is the one that is triumphant. She's the one that's holding the chess figure. She seems to be in the winning position, as we see on the figure on the far right there. But even more profoundly amusing subjects are found on a casket devoted to the scene, the biblical scene of the parable of the prodigal son. And here we have, of course, the chess game becomes a subject where he's driven out and taken his wealth on his own, gone on his travels, and lived a luxurious life in the company of courtesans. And as you can see there on the left, he is in the process of being defeated in chess by the young lady, and he's literally lost his clothes. It's kind of a form of strip poker, it seems, before he's thrown out of the young courtesan's household. All of these games are of great interest because they give us a glimpse of another side of life in the secular world during the Middle Ages, and certainly that of the games that we even know today of field hockey and other sporting games are depicted on such works as misericords. These are under the bottoms of the seats of choir stalls in the cathedrals, and this particularly playful one in Barcelona Cathedral after the end of the 15th century shows how the game, a form of stickball maybe, is played with hockey sticks, and certainly was a game in its form as it was first developed. So such games were very much part of the culture of the period, but we happen to have very precious few examples of them. But I thought it would be appropriate to end with one of the most charming subjects that survives of something that is absolutely seasonally appropriate, although not this season, a snowball fight. And it is a monumental representation in the Aquila Tower of the Trento in northern Lombardy, right on the slopes of the Alps, in the tower that was erected by the bishops of Liechtenstein at the end of the 14th century. And here we have scenes of a courtly snowball fight, and it's the first monumental landscape we have surviving in Western art, depicted especially with the winter scenes, incorporating the subject of a sporting event of sorts with this snowball fight. And this was one of the scenes of personifying January, the month of January. It had other scenes devoted to the other 12 months of the year, but that of January was devoted to this event that was immortalized as the first recorded snowball fight that we have in the history of art. Thank you very much.